Oh, here we go. All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Auditor General Committee meeting. I call this Auditor General meeting of Friday, November 26, 2021 to order. Is that a feedback thing?
Echo.
Okay, thanks. This committee meeting is being convened by electronic means as authorized under Part 14 of the procedural bylaw. As such, committee members may participate in person or by electronic means. If any committee council member loses connection during the voting process, we have staff on hand to facilitate getting. All right, and we will now proceed to our item of business on today's agenda, the 2022 Auditor General Operating Budget. Does any committee member wish to declare? And I believe we have a PowerPoint with that as well. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Chair Fry. Just give me a moment. I will get this up and running. There we go. Are my slides up? Are my slides?
Yep. Yep, we've got your slides up.
All right, thank you, Chair Fry and Auditor General Committee members for having me here today to present the first budget for the City of Vancouver's Office of the Auditor General. In accordance with the process described in Section 5.3 of the Auditor General bylaw, my budget request is handled separately from the City's overall budget process. The bylaw calls for me to present a budget request to the Auditor General Committee. The Auditor General Committee, in turn, after clarifications and consultations with me, is responsible for submitting a recommendation to Council on the budget for my office. In my brief presentation, I'm going to be less than 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about three things. First, I'll talk about the three factors that drive my budget. If anyone can recall the document produced by the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation in 2020 outlining the process for establishing the Auditor General's office, each of these items are identified, so there really should be no surprises here. Next will be the actual budget request itself. It's a pretty small office, so it's going to be quite straightforward. And lastly, I want to provide some context for this transitional year by showing you a pro forma budget for what the Auditor General's office would look, or the budget would look like at full strength. So the first budget driver is staffing. It's the single largest driver, comprising 80% of the total cost. And that's the salaries and benefits for me and the 8 staff I intend to hire over the course of the year. This includes also training to meet professional standards and ensure that new staff are ready to perform. The staffing plan that underlies this figure was outlined in my 100-day presentation to the Auditor General Committee on September 17th. And there I outlined a staged process, starting first with senior staff, who I expect to have in place by February, followed by operational and support staff following in March and in April, so at the end of Q1 and the beginning of Q2. The second driver is contracted services, and this represents 14% of the budget. I appreciate that this line item can be challenging for those approving budgets. They see contractor, and the first inclination is to assume it's something that can easily be done without. Challenges I can't easily do without because I require contractors to meet Canadian audit standards. Those standards specify that the audit team must possess sufficient knowledge of the subject matter in order to conduct the work. So we fill out our audit teams by contracting with subject matter experts. So there's two significant unknowns underlying my estimate for this figure. First is the nature of the project selected. That's going to drive the figure. And as you know, my audit plan is not due to be presented to the Auditor General Committee until the end of January. So it's still a work in progress. The other side is the skill set of my team. Given that staff are only in the process of being hired, I can only assume at this point what expertise they're going to have. So given these uncertainties, I've used my best estimate of what's going to be needed. The next component of contracted services is contractors to provide quality assurance review to meet Canadian audit standards and also the practice requirements of the Chartered Professional Accountants of British Columbia that license my office. The last component is for desktop publishing and editing. Regardless of the nature of the contract, all contracts will go out to tender, public tender, seeking best value for the city. The third budget driver is in the form of one-time costs to set up the office, representing 4% of the budget. There's three components to this. First, there's a one-time cost to purchase and set up audit software. The amount I've included here is reflective of the cost that the Auditor General for Local Government's Office experienced when they set up the same software. I'll work with my senior team, of course, once they're hired, to explore if we can either trim this cost or look at an alternative service provider at a lower cost. The second one-time cost relates to the physical setup and configuration of my office. As an independent audit office, independent from the city's staff and functioning, there is a need for a physical separation. And without getting into details, we don't have that now, but because it's a matter of security and an issue that security is actively monitoring, it's already come to my attention that there is a bona fide need for this. The city's facilities department has provided an estimate to put walls and security in place, but they've also indicated that there'll be minimal direct cost to this budget since it's an operational activity that's anticipated under the budget for the city's office accommodation plan. And lastly, is IT configuration. It represents the per staff chargeback from the city's IT department for initial equipment purchase and setup. Now, please note, I've not asked for a separate email server or separate secure file storage server, which would have had significant cost impacts associated with them. Instead, I've chosen to work with the city's IT department to find a way that's more cost effective. I'll come back to that topic in just a moment. So here's the budget amount I'm asking you to approve, a total of $1.636 million broken down as shown in this table, approximately $1.3 million for staff and training, $235,000 for contracted services, $30,000 for overhead and general miscellaneous costs, and then $64,000 for one-time costs related to IT, security configuration, and software acquisition. Now, I take the value for money component of my mandate seriously and believe it should begin nowhere more than right here in my office, and that should be right off the get-go. I'd like to point out some of the cost-saving efforts I've made in putting this budget together. First of all, is the delay in hiring. You may recall in my 100-day plan, I was going to hire some admin support fairly early on, and indeed I have room for that in the current year's budget for 2021. But the reality is, in good conscience, I could not hire someone and not have them fully engaged. So instead, I've been managing my own calendar and email. I'm doing my own documents, maybe not as well as somebody else might have, but good enough. And I've sought support from the city clerk's office where needed, meaning that I've been able to delay the hiring of this position until Q2. I've also delayed hiring of field staff until the end of Q1 or early Q2, when we'll have the senior management team in place to put them to work. Now, as an independent office, the case can be made to keep it fully separate from the City of Vancouver's services. And indeed, some auditors general across the country do this very thing and insist on it. I've decided not to go down that route and use city services wherever feasible and cost effective, rather than paying third parties, all to keep costs as low as possible while still delivering the service effectively and respecting of necessary confidentiality. So for instance, I'm currently occupying space in a city-owned building. It's called the West Annex. It's convenient to City Hall. There's no additional rent for having this space as there would be if we'd had a third-party landlord. I've been using internal HR resources to conduct staffing and recruitment rather than using an external recruitment agency, which could have been justified, especially for the senior positions. I'm using IT support for secure file storage, email, and web page services. Now, there's a potential issue here, and we're going to need to ensure it's operating with integrity. In the meantime, I'm operating under a good faith assumption that all is as it's been told to me. I'll be having further conversations about this with the city's new chief technology officer on Monday next week. Training. I'm going to do much of the foundational staff training myself, having some experience in doing that, much like I did the audit orientation training for council myself, rather than bringing in an external facilitator. And lastly, we'll be relying on the city's legal services rather than bringing in external counsel, except perhaps in specialized cases. Anyway, combined, these efforts have reduced my budget request rather significantly. So this is my last slide, showing how the 2022 budget request compares to what it would have looked like had this not been a transitional year. And the difference, bottom line, is about $250,000. I believe this is entirely consistent with the potential cost described to Council by the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation. And indeed, were it not for the decisions described in my previous slide, it would have been considerably higher. Now, I present this for context. I appreciate that this committee cannot approve the budget of future years, but I think it's important to understand how a transitional 2022 budget stacks up in relation to a full year of operations. Also, it provides a placeholder figure for the city should they choose to use it in the 2023 budget cycle. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Mike. Committee members, if you have any questions, please add yourself to the Crestron queue. Archie and Karen, you may use the raise hand function, which is located on the lower right of the WebEx. First on the queue. Oh,
For the
sorry.
privilege, Chair, could I be added to the queue, please? It's Councillor Kirby-Young.
Sure thing. And first on the queue is Councillor Hardwick. Councillor Hardwick.
Thank you very much. This is consistent with the research that I did looking at comparable departments across the country in terms of size and breakdown of the budget. I'm actually looking forward now that we have this to run a bit of a comparison. I wanted to hear more about the IT configuration, since we do live in an era of dirty tricks. Why have you taken the position that you have? Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Why are you being not more protective?
Well, there are a couple of reasons for that, Councillor Hardwick. The first is that the city is actually moving away from hardened infrastructure for file storage and is moving towards a cloud-based pilot. And so actually I'm one of the first groups that's moving towards that. So what that means is that the files will be stored in the cloud in a secure area that only certain people will have access to. It's cost effective, it's in compliant with privacy legislation, and that the cloud storage is entirely within Canada. And it just makes sense in this modern era where it can be accessed from wherever staff happen to be working. It is a bit of a leap of good faith, if you will. I could have gone for a more secure file storage, having a hardened file server right here in our premises. But I had to look at the costs and the potential risk. I think that risk of inappropriate access can be mitigated through, quite frankly, a bit of audit procedures that I'm more than happy to have my staff undertake.
You mentioned that you're going to be meeting with the new Chief Technology Officer. Are you going to meet also with our recently appointed Integrity Commissioner?
Yes, that's certainly on my list. I have not yet set up a time, though.
Just wondering if there are any alignments there. It's clear that you've done forward thinking on your budget, and the numbers are consistent with what I would have expected based on the research. I was prepared to come in and pick the budget apart, but you've made that difficult to do. Yeah, could you also provide like a Gantt chart or a calendar that would show when you would see different staff coming on board? Just, I think it's helpful to be able to contextualize that for council or for this committee.
I certainly could, Councillor Hardwick, yes.
Okay, that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Councillor Hardwick. Councillor Kirby-Young.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Mike, for the presentation. The question that I have is you've got a budget ask with a small amount of one-time cost of approximately 1.6 altogether. And I believe when council was deliberating on establishing the Office for the Auditor General, the estimate for a full year when the service was up and running was approximately $2 million. My question to you, so that we are equipped to answer it also, because it will probably get asked by our council colleagues, is with the hiring of staff, which you've indicated you expect it to happen in Q1 and Q2, is that sort of a realistic budget given that you won't have staff a lot of staff in place, say till the end of Q1 or the end of Q2. There might be some potential challenges or delays in hiring, for example. So I'm just wondering if you can comment around how optimistic the budget is in terms of when people will be on board, and could we expect in 2023, in a full year, we're up and running, that the total budget would be around that previously estimated $2 million mark?
Uh, Thank you for the question, Councillor Kirby. And I've tried to be realistic as opposed to either optimistic or pessimistic. We are currently in the process of recruiting a Deputy Auditor General and 2 senior staff. And I guess I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we get qualified applicants. I've certainly been shaking the tree personally and through my network. And but I don't yet know who has applied, and it doesn't actually close until Sunday. So we'll know better next week what that looks like. I'm allowing a reasonable amount of time to conduct proper interviews, to do proper background checks, and then to allow these senior positions appropriate time to give notice, assuming that they are presently employed elsewhere in similar roles. So it is a staged process. I've planned it out month by month, and it's as good a guesstimate as I can put together, knowing what I know now, neither optimistic nor pessimistic.
Okay, and the
The-
second question is, what does a full year's budget look like, given that this accounts for staff starting partway through the year? So what could council expect for a full year budget in 2023, for example?
Well, if knowing what I know today and what I've projected on the 8th slide in the presentation was that the full strength pro forma budget would be approximately $1.9 million, so just below the $2 million mark. It would have been over $2 million though if I'd taken a different approach, say for renting premises from the private sector rather than using city buildings. If we'd required separate installation and maintenance of email and file storage servers, for instance, those 2 items would have alone would probably have put me closer to 2.1 million.
Okay, that's very helpful, because I'm sure that council will have similar questions, and it's sort of our job to be able to respond to those. So thank you. I appreciate the context.
That's it, Councillor Kervia?
Yes, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Wiebe?
Yeah, I have a few questions. I was actually surprised at the limited amount of data that was provided in your report. My first question is, what is the total value of the cost savings, including staffing, that you've presented? Recognizing you says it could have been quite a bit larger. And what is the value of the in-kind cost to the city?
So there's the 2 components. If you have a quick peek at slide 8, we're looking at approximately $200,000 in staffing costs, about $100,000 in contracted services, and of course there's the one-time cost of $64,000 that will not be incurred in future years. So that together sort of outlines what the difference is between this transitional year, this partial year, and what a full year would look like. Now the second part of your question, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I understood what you were asking, Councillor Wiebe.
Well, yeah, when I was with the provincial government, we moved to billing out for all the in-kind services that are provided by the department. So for you, you've said HR, all those services that you are getting in kind from the City of Vancouver. What is the valuation that you are putting to that number?
I haven't, because I haven't been provided with any information from the city that would allow me to do that. My understanding is that those services are not routinely charged back to operational departments within the city. So there really wasn't a mechanism to estimate, say, for instance, the cost of HR to support recruitment.
Okay, or rent or any of those, there's not a square footage of rent that you're allocating as in kind, it's all.
Again, in city-owned premises, there isn't a chargeback to operational departments. They only pay for, or they will only have that figure in their budgets if they're renting from a third-party landlord, is my understanding.
Okay, recognizing that in our budget, we have a $1 million ongoing funding allocation and you're coming in higher than that amount. Can you talk about what elements of the budget you're presenting could be considered one-time funding and not ongoing funding.
Right. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the $1 million envelope you're referring to.
Doesn't exist.
So
But
in
the,
our budget that's in front of us for deliberation, if you look at, it talks about there being a one-time or $1 million. Let me pull it up right now. There'll be a $1 million for ongoing funding, as well as 9 million as one time. This is in the allocation as consideration C as part of our capital and operating budget that's being brought forward to council. So I'm just wondering, recognizing that your funding is not included in the 5% that's been brought forward to us, how much of your funding ask could be put forward as one-time funding and how much can be brought forward as ongoing funding, recognizing our constraints here as a city?
the one-time component is identifies at $64,000.
So none of the contractual elements of it and none of that could be considered a one-time funding, recognizing, or is that something you want to ensure that there's ongoing budget to ensure the viability of the office?
In order to do the work and meet Canadian auditing standards, there will be an ongoing budget for contracted services. So it's far more cost effective to have somebody come in, work for a few hours, provide quality control work, than to have somebody permanently on staff to provide that at a considerably higher cost. So I think you'll find that that's a fairly common practice in small offices. Certainly it was for the Auditor General for local government. They had an ongoing contractor budget that they brought in quality control reviewers, technical expertise, and subject matter experts. With respect to subject matter experts, they're going to change from project to project depending on what we're looking at. So they appreciate that a subject matter expert, say in engineering, is going to be quite different than a subject matter expert we might bring in to look at an IT project, and that will change from project to project.
And do you
But
think that the valuation you have, which isn't that large for the contractual, is enough to deal with it? And what happens when you need more funding? What is the normal process that you would go to get increased funding if you need to significantly increase your contractual elements?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I would very much not want to have to do that, and I have not really considered what the option would be for seeking more funding. My first option would be to see what we can defer and delay in order to work within our operating envelope. The figures that I've used for estimating costs are pretty consistent with what, say, the Auditor General for local government would do for the kinds of audits that they did across the province in various different areas. And in conferring with my colleagues, it's in the right ballpark. So looking at similar sized offices in other parts of the country, Ottawa, Halifax, whatnot, our contracted costs, or excuse me, my contract budget is very similar.
Councillor, we're
Okay.
just coming up on your time. Would you like to move for a second round of questions?
Yeah, I'd like to move for a second round, please.
Seconder?
We need a seconder for the procedure for in committee, Chair.
Currently not. Okay. Second round questions it is. All in favor?
Aye.
Sure.
Okay. Please proceed, Councillor Weed.
I'll cede the floor until my next round. Recognize the time. Thank you.
Actually, Councillor Weed, I don't see anybody else on the queue for questions, so.
Okay, I guess my second question is, recognizing we have some great experienced people at the City of Vancouver, have you looked at utilizing any of our staff in your office?
Well, I can't really say that I can utilize them in the sense that that presents an inherent conflict of interest. Either you're part of the audit team or you're part of the city's team. So I'm very open, though, if any members of the city staff, be that in the internal audit department, for instance, or other groups, are interested in coming over to the Auditor General's office, I'd be more than happy to look at those applications, and they will have to go through the same process as anyone else.
Thank you. Appreciate that answer. That's all my questions.
Great. Thanks, Councillor Weed. Okay, and I see no further questions. And since there are no public speakers registered to speak to this item, we can go to debate and decision. Would anyone like to move a motion? And is there any discussion?
Sorry, I actually had raised my hand.
Oh, my apologies, Karen. Yeah.
It's Karen Kilton.
Okay, please Please
I'll
proceed.
just lower it now. I guess, the overall budget, I don't really have any comments on, but just looking ahead to the 3-year plan that you'll be presenting to the committee, does the amount of resources you're requesting align with your preliminary thinking about what you plan to do over the next 3 years?
Thank you for that question, Karen. And yes, it is consistent. That being said, that plan's not finalized, and it's a moving target, if you will. Um, You'll appreciate that there's some projects that are larger than others, some projects that are going to be more complicated than others, and will mean that we'll need more subject matter expertise in some areas than in others. What I want to do year over year is have a healthy mix, in terms of coverage across the city, and a healthy mix in terms of the complexity of audits. Um, there's a risk in performance audit for trying to take on too much, having too large a scope, and what that inevitably means is that projects drag on for far too long. And it's an issue that's plagued auditors general across the country at all levels, federal, provincial, and local government. And it's something that I want to avoid by having that healthy mix and focusing, being very clear on what our scope is in particular areas, so that we don't end up with monster projects that go over budget and put me in that unfortunate position of having to come to this committee looking for more funds.
Thank you. No more questions.
Great, thanks. And because I'm unable to see the raise hand feature on the WebEx, Archie, did you have it? No? Okay. Seeing none, then we will move on to debate decision. Would anyone like to move a motion? Is there any discussion? I see Councillor Hardwick is first on the queue. Advancing Councillor Hardwick.
Yes, I would like to move the recommendations of the Auditor General. I sent that into the clerk. Hopefully I did it properly. Clerk.
We're just putting the motion up on the screen. If you could
Thanks, Deputy City Clerk.
just be patient with us.
Councillor Hardwick, we were just trying to get this up on the screen. Here we go.
Apologies for that. We have been having a few technical issues in the chamber. It's on the screen now.
Thank you, Clerk. Okay, so we have the amendment by Councillor Hardwick on the screen.
I don't know if, is it an amendment or am I just moving the recommendation?
Oh, I assumed there was an amendment in there in red as well. No?
I must have missed something.
Oh, I'm seeing the red text and assumed that that was an amendment to.
Oh, I think that they just fixed my,
Okay,
that's correct. That was my boo-boo.
okay, great. Okay, so we have a motion on the floor. Anybody like to speak to it?
I'd like to, Chair. I'm sorry I don't have access to the Creston panel.
Okay, so we'll make an amendment Q. Is that how we work? Clerk, do I put
It's
this on
just
the?
a few.
And
Recognizing Councillor Kirby. Yeah,
yep,
I'll
okay,
go on.
here we go. Councillor Kirby Young.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And I want to thank our new Auditor General, Mike McDonnell, for the presentation, the preparation of the budget. I appreciate the fiscal prudence that has gone into its preparation and the contextual explanation beforehand. I think that recognizing that the Office of the Auditor General, by its very construct and definition, is independent of the City of Vancouver, needs to remain so with respects to its staff and its work and protection of the information that it is utilizing in order to perform that work. I think that this represents a very responsible approach in terms of still being able to utilize civic facilities and that in terms of maintaining value for the taxpayer, and I'm appreciative of that. The job of this committee now, just in terms of the public understanding what's next, is to take this forward as part of the budget deliberations that are coming before council, which are upcoming at the early December, as council knows. And I think it's also important to note that you won't see this line item contained in the original draft budget because this meeting procedurally needed to happen prior to that meeting in order for the AG to formally endorse a budget recommendation and the specific amount of that requirement and then bring that forward. So that will be the committee's job to do that and integrate it into the budget process. I do want to say that I'm really pleased to see that we will be staffing up the office in 2022 and bringing this important and valuable function to the City of Vancouver, the only sort of major city in Canada that does not yet have this function of the independent auditor, which, as we know, is different than internal audit functions that most cities have had for a much longer period of time. And I am really looking forward to some of the initial reports that will come forward from the office and the role that they will play in building and I would also say, quite frankly, rebuilding, I think, the confidence of taxpayers in Vancouver. And I'm also hopeful that our Auditor General, it really takes to heart so a lot of the good work that has been done by counterparts across the country where this function has really demonstrated a very strong ROI in terms of being able to identify efficiencies and opportunities for better leveraging of budgets or, you know, how services are contracted out and a number of pieces. So it's been a lot of work to get here. I appreciate Councillor Hardwick's leadership on it, the work of the recruitment committee and the work of this committee ongoing now. And I'm looking forward for it becoming tangible for the public when first audit reports start to be released, and hopefully we'll see one or two of those next year. So I'm happy to support this, and I appreciate the work in bringing it forward.
Thanks, Councillor Kirby-Young. Councillor Wiebe.
Yeah, I guess I wonder if I can ask a point of information through you to Mike.
Sure.
Auditor
Go
General.
ahead.
Mine would be on the use of the word endorse to this committee. I'm just wondering why you felt it was important to have this committee endorse this prior to going to council for approval.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Wiebe. It's my understanding that the Auditor General bylaw spells out the process and that this committee is required to make a recommendation to council for my budget. If we want to talk about endorse, I've presented you with a figure and I'm hoping that you will be comfortable recommending that figure to council and hence endorsing my budget request.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think this is really important. I really appreciate that this has moved forward and everyone behind getting it to this point. Currently, as is, this will increase the property tax that we are currently looking at, recognizing that this is not included in the budget being brought before us. I think it's an integral part to moving forward and building that trust and recognizing that we do need to spend money upfront to ensure we have the staff and the office put in place to look at what opportunities we have for cost savings in the future. But it is going to be a cost that we're going to have to bring on. So I will be happily supporting this and be very interested to hear the conversations that will happen at council because this will be a very important dialogue recognizing the amount of money and our current budget constraints. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Wiebe. And before we proceed, I see that our hardworking representative at the Federal Municipalities of Canada, Councillor Bly, has joined us. Councillor, I'm not sure if you wanted to do a check-in and see if you're able to speak or test your mic.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'm just checking. Can you hear me?
Yes, come through loud and clear. Did you want to be added to the
Okay,
queue
great.
to speak to this?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Next on the list is Councillor Hardwick.
Well, I just wanted to say, looking at this and again, tracking it back to the research that's been done in the area, what I'm seeing here is an example of leading by example. And that's tremendous that the Auditor General has shown that he takes value for money seriously into consideration, showing us what he's done versus what he, where the savings are up front. I would have naturally gone in and done a line analysis on it, but it's nice to, when someone's done it preemptively up front, really thoughtful. It's shown an exhaustive process, and I really appreciated that this is not aspirational, but based on best practices and evidence. And so I'm encouraged at the approach. As Councillor Kirby Young pointed out, the Auditor General office is something that exists in every other major Canadian city, and that we've now joined those ranks. And while we don't like to put it up this way, the ROI on this department is something that the city can look forward to in the future. And by ROI, I mean return on investment, so that every dollar that's spent here will be returned in multiples. We'll see. I know what it is in the other cities. So I do see this as money well spent. But as I said, I see the Auditor General leading by example in the manner in which he has approached this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hardwick. Councillor Bly.
Thanks very much, Chair. Just making sure you can hear me.
Sound great. Thanks.
Okay, great. I'll keep this very brief, as you mentioned, and I do appreciate being able to connect remotely. I'm still in transit here, leaving Ottawa, but so I will keep my comments brief, and did have the opportunity to connect with our Auditor General, Mike Donnell, on a number of topics and the work that the Auditor General Office will be undertaking, and the required funding to do this and to do it well. And so I appreciate Councillor Kirby Young and Councillor Hardwick and Councillor Weed's comments, and echo all of them, and that we need to prioritize this work, and the process is such that it's not included in the draft budget, but by this committee's endorsement will help move that to the next stage. So I'll leave it there. Fully support the work, and do appreciate the clear information provided by Mike in order for us to make a decision on this today and take this conversation into next week.
Great. Thanks so much,
That's
Councillor.
all.
Thank you very much for joining us, and pleasant travels home. Look forward to seeing you soon. We have no more speakers signed up on this, and I just want to add a few words myself. I've really had the privilege of working with Mike McDonnell on some of this, and I know that we've all variously across our council really articulated support for the idea of the Auditor General's office, and this is where we put our money where our mouth is. And I'm very hopeful. I feel a little bit like we're planting a tree today, and that this time next year, that tree will be bearing fruit, and we'll be picking those fruit, and we'll look back on this moment and with some gratitude, recognizing that this was an important step and a big step for the City of Vancouver. So yeah, really looking forward to ongoing work with this committee and with Mike, and as he grows his team and sets up an office. So without any further ado, I think we can move to a vote on this. Clerks, if we could pull up the voting queue.
Can I have a vote assist in favor, please, Councillor Kirby Young?
Likewise, Councillor Bly in favor.
And that passes with none in opposition. So that's unanimous. Great. Thank you, committee. This concludes our only item on the agenda. Our next Auditor General Committee meeting is on Friday, January 28th, 2022 at 1 p.m. And with that,
Would
we
you
have
like
a
a motion to adjourn?
Thanks, Councillor Hardwick. All right, all those in favor say yay.
Yay.
Yay. Opposed say nay. All right, the motion carries unanimously, and this meeting is now adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.